feeling ensued between them, which, when it does take place between persons of really congenial dispositions, produces the most delightful results of human companionship. No one who has not endured the tedium of a sea voyage can at all be aware of what a pleasant thing it is to have some one on board in the rich stores of whose intellect and fancy one can find a never ending amusement. The winds might now whistle through the cordage, and the waves toss the great ship on their foaming crests; still Thornhill and Geoffrey were together, finding in the midst of danger solace in each other's society, and each animating the other to the performance of deeds of daring that astonished the crew. The whole voyage was one of the greatest peril, and some of the oldest seamen on board did not scruple, during the continuance of their night watches, to intimate to their companions that the ship, in their opinion, would never reach England, and that she would founder somewhere along the long stretch of the African coast. The captain, of course, made every possible exertion to put a stop to such prophetic sayings, but when once they commenced, in short time there is no such thing as completely eradicating them, and they of course produce the most injurious effect, paralyzing the exertions of the crew in times of danger, and making them believe that they are in a doomed ship, and consequently all they can do is useless. Sailors are extremely superstitious on such matters, and there cannot be any reasonable doubt but that some of the disasters that befell the Neptune on her homeward voyage from India may be attributable to this feeling of fatality getting hold of the seamen, and inducing them to think that, let them try what they might, they could not save the ship. It happened that after they had rounded the cape a dense fog came on, such as had not been known on that coast for many a year. Although the western shore of Africa at some season of the year is subject to such a species of vaporous exhalation, every object was wrapped in the most profound gloom, and yet there was a strong eddy or current of the ocean, flowing parallel with the land, and, as the captain hoped, rather off than on the shore. In consequence of this fear, the greatest anxiety prevailed on board the vessel, and lights were left burning on all parts of the deck, while two men were continually engaged making soundings. It was about half an hour after midnight, as the chronometer indicated a storm, that suddenly the men who were on watch on the deck raised a loud cry of alarm. They had suddenly seen, close to the laboured bow lights, which must belong to some vessel that, like the Neptune, was encompassed in the fog, and a collision was quite inevitable, for neither ship had time to put about. The only doubt, which was a fearful and an agonizing one to have solved, was whether the stronger vessel was of sufficient bulk and power to run them down, or they it, and that fearful question was one which a few moments must settle. In fact, almost before the echo of that cry of horror, which had come from the men, had died away, the vessels met. There was a hideous crash, one shriek of dismay and horror, and then all was still. The Neptune, with considerable damage and some of the bulwarks stove in, sailed on, but the other ship went with a surging sound to the bottom of the sea. Alas, nothing could be done. The fog was so dense that, coupled too with the darkness of the night, there could be no hope of rescuing one of the ill-fated crew of the ship, and the officers and seamen of the Neptune, although they shouted for some time, and then listened to hear if any of the survivors of the ship that had been run down were swimming, no answers came to them. And when, in about 6 hours more, they sailed out of the fog into a clear sunshine, where there was not so much as a cloud to be seen, they looked at each other like men newly awakened from some strange and fearful dream. They never discovered the name of the ship they had run down, and the whole affair remained a profound mystery. When the Neptune reached the port of London, the affair was repeated, and every exertion made to obtain some information concerning the ill-fated ship that had met with so fearful a doom. Such were the circumstances which awakened all the liveliest feelings of gratitude on the part of Colonel Jeffrey towards Mr. Thornhill, and hence it was that he was in London, and had the necessary leisure so to do, to leave no stone unturned to discover what had become of him. After deep and anxious thought, and feeling convinced that there was some mystery which it was beyond his power to discover, he resolved upon asking the opinion of a friend, likewise in the army, a Captain Rathbone, concerning the whole of the facts. This gentleman, and a gentleman he was in the fullest acceptation of the term, was in London. In fact, he had retired from active service, and inhabited a small but pleasant house in the outskirts of the metropolis. It was one of those old-fashioned cottage residences, with all sorts of odd places and corners about it, and a thriving garden full of fine old wood, such as are rather rare near to London, and which are daily becoming more rare, in consequence of the value of the land immediately contiguous to the metropolis not permitting large pieces to remain attached to small residences. Captain Rathbone had an amiable family about him, such as he was and might well be proud of, and was living in as great a state of domestic felicity as this world could very well afford him. It was to this gentleman, then, that Colonel Jeffrey resolved upon going to lay all the circumstances before him concerning the possible and probable fate of poor Thornhill. This distance was not so great but that he could walk it conveniently, and he did so, arriving towards the dusk of the evening on the day following that which had witnessed his deeply interesting interview with Joanna Oakley in the Temple Gardens. There is nothing on earth so delightfully refreshing, after a dusty and rather a long country walk, as to suddenly enter a well kept and extremely verdant garden, and this was the case especially to the feelings of Colonel Jeffrey when he arrived at Lime Tree Lodge, the residence of Captain Rathbone. He was met with a most cordial and frank welcome, a welcome which he expected, but which was none the less delightful on that account, and after sitting a while with the family in the house, he and the captain strolled into the garden, and then Colonel Jeffrey commenced with his revelation. The captain, with very few interruptions, heard him to the end, and when he concluded by saying, "And now I have come to ask your advice upon all these matters," the captain immediately replied in his warm, offhand manner, "I'm afraid you won't find my advice of much importance, but I offer you my active cooperation in anything you think ought to be done or can be done in this affair, which, I assure you, deeply interests me, and gives me the greatest possible impulse to exertion. You have to command me in the matter, and I am completely at your disposal." "I was quite certain you would say as much. But notwithstanding the manner in which you shrink from giving an opinion, I am anxious to know what you really think with regard to what are, you will allow, most extraordinary circumstances." "The most natural thing in the world," said Captain Rathbone, at the first flush of affair, "seemed to be that we ought to look for your friend Thornhill at the point where he disappeared." "At the barber's in Fleet Street?" "Precisely. Did he leave, or did he not?" "Sweeney Todd says that he left him, and proceeded down the street towards the city, in pursuance of a direction he had given to Mr. Oakley, the spectacle maker, and that he saw him get into some sort of disturbance at the end of the market. But to put against that, we have the fact of the dog remaining by the barber's door, and his refusing to leave it on any amount of solicitation. Now the very fact that a dog could act in such a way proclaims an amount of sagacity that seems to tell loudly against the presumption that such a creature could make any mistake." "It does. What say you, now, to going into town tomorrow morning, and making a call at the barber's, without proclaiming we have any special errand except to be shaved and dressed?" "Do you think he would know you again?" "Scarcely, in plain clothes. I was in my undress uniform when I called with the captain of the Neptune, so that his impression of me must be decidedly of a military character, and the probability is, that he would not know me at all in the clothes of a civilian. I like the idea of giving a call at the barber's. Do you think your friend Thornhill was a man likely to talk about